So there are a few things which you need to keep in mind before approaching investors. One is, what is the problem you're trying to solve? Is the problem really large enough to interest the investors? Then where are you in the journey? Do you have a minimum viable product, which again Sachin alluded to? Then does the management team have the expertise to execute what you're set out to do? And before you before you approach the investors, very important to know where you stand in the valuation game. Are your valuation expectations really realistic? Are they in sync with what is happening in the market? So factors to be considered while raising funds: what are your growth plans? What are your expansion plans? What are your long-term capital needs? What is your expertise? Then how much are you willing to dilute? Because each fundraise you do, you need to dilute certain percentage of your own ownership or the founding team ownership. So you need to be like really smart and really clear on what percentage are you willing to give up or what percentage are you going to dilute. So there are a lot of factors to be considered while raising funds. One is especially if you are raising short-term funds, what is your repayment capability? Do you need funds for short-term or do you really need for long-term? How do you manage your dilution? Then if you are raising debt, then there's the added burden of interest cost, which is going to go out of your cash flow and P&L. And especially when you're raising funds, you need to get a valuation report done. So while Sachin alluded to the funding, I'm just putting it in terms of order, like how does a funding deal go through in a sequential manner. One is, there are certain pre-deal things we need to be very clear. How much do we want to raise? And which are the type of investors we want to go to? Finding the right investor is very important. I mean, we should not, like Sachin said, gave examples of wrong investor giving wrong terms, which can really derail a very good project or a startup. So how much we want to raise, what is the type of investor we want to go to, and good investors bring always something extra. It's not only the money. They give you access to other investors, they give you access to other companies whom they've already worked with, access to markets, access to senior management introduction in various companies, which could help your company, in terms of sales or maybe just, exchange of ideas, etc. And finally, you get the term sheet and the valuation when you are going through the deal. During the deal, there is always due diligence, which is very important. I think Protein Box spoke about compliance. Absolutely important to have your books, documents, etc. squeaky clean from day one. From day one, hire a good lawyer, hire a good chartered accountant, hire a good company secretary, and preferably somebody who has already worked in the startup ecosystem. Absolutely important. I mean, no cost cutting over here. Make sure, and as a founder, you're also responsible, so make sure that you're on top of it. You just can't leave it to somebody to take care of this. And then you have to, once the due diligence is done, or parallelly, you have the transaction documents which get prepared, either a share subscription agreement, shareholders agreement, etc. Then typically post-deal, there are certain conditions which need to be met, and all the filings which need to be done to the various authorities, which mostly in the case of a startup is with the ROC and MCA. So there are various types of instruments one can issue when you're doing a funding round. The most common is, of course, equity, which is common stock, which gives investors voting rights. But most investors prefer CCPS because it has certain other benefits attached to it. Like, for example, they can get a liquidity preference in case the company is shutting down, or there is a liquidity when they get extra rights over the common stockholders. So preferably they take CCPS, which anyway gets converted to equity at a later date. Of late, a lot of companies are issuing CCD also, which is compulsorily convertible debenture. So this typically happens in early stage when there is no metrics to arrive at a valuation. So basically you postpone the valuation decision to a later date. Again, as the startup ecosystem has evolved over the last few years, some of the US funding instruments have come into India as well, like convertible notes. So many issue convertible notes in India as against CCD, but it comes with its own caveats, like the minimum ticket size per investor has to be 25 lakhs and so on. Also in US, the iSafe notes are very popular, and while in India, iSafe is not really legally allowed, it takes the form of a CCPS in India. So during a funding transaction, these are some of the compliance professionals or compliance firms you may need to work with. So as Sachin also alluded, get good professionals who have worked in the startup ecosystem, take reference from other founders, take reference from investors, and make sure you have the best people working on your transaction. You need a good lawyer, you need a good company secretary, you need a good valuer, and you need a good CACS firm who will help you navigate the deal along with the investor or the investor's legal team. So I'll just quickly walk through what is a term sheet and transaction documents. So term sheet, the parties to the term sheet are typically the founders and the investors. Then there is a cap table, which basically shows like who owns what percentage of the company, and post the transaction, who will own what percentage of the company. Pre-money and post-money valuation, very simple. Pre-money is what is the valuation at which the investor is putting, and post-money is what is the valuation post the transaction, post the investment amount. And of course, finally, what is the instrument which we are going to issue to the investor. So these are some of the key clauses. I won't go into too much detail because some of these are technical, but these are some of the key clauses which need to be negotiated and inked during a transaction. So there is founders vesting. So typically, investors would want the founders to stay on for a long time, so that their investment also pays out. So typically, there is a vesting on the founder's shares, which could be 3 years or 4 years, etc. So typically it's about 4 years, so that they can protect against either a founder leaving, or there is a termination, and there is some clawback at least on the shares. Right of first refusal, and there is right of first offer. So in the case of right of first refusal, the selling shareholder needs to get a offer from the market, and then he can go to the shareholder who has the right of first refusal and conclude the transaction. In right of first offer, selling shareholder need not go. The shareholder who has the ROFO deed can execute the transaction. I know these are a little technical, but good to know that these terms exist, so that when you do your transaction, you can at least check on these terms with your legal professionals who's working with. So then we have things like tag along, drag along, and Sachin alluded to ESOP pool as well. Tag along is basically for minority shareholders, so that they can tag along with the main shareholder should there be an exit or should there be an offer for sale. Drag along is slightly, it is opposite of tag along, where the main shareholder can drag all the other shareholders in case there is an offer for sale or an exit. And typically, at the time of the first transaction, good to create an ESOP pool, so that you can give ESOP to the early employees who join, who may not be on market salary, and it may also incentivize them for taking a risk of joining a startup at a very early stage. So So these are some of the key clauses in a term sheet of SHA. These are very important to negotiate because, I mean, once that is an investment, then you have an investor on board. So it is very important to know, and typically most incoming investors ask for board rights and information rights. So it's very important to know like what are the rights you are like giving to the incoming investor. So typically most investors insist on board rights, so that like they want to be a nominee director, they want to know what is going on in the company, attend the board meetings of the company, make sure they are in sync with the strategy of the company. And most of them will also ask for information rights. Information rights is not only your annual reports or your annual financials, but they may also want a monthly update on the status of the company, like a monthly MIS report, etc., annual audited financials, etc. And then there are also certain very important matters which may be classified under reserved matters. So if you're taking, if the company wants to like acquire another company or like set up a subsidiary in US, etc., these may be categorized under reserved matters, which may basically you may need prior approval from the existing investors before you carry out or execute such transactions. So these are very important to keep in mind and make sure that these are drafted, well understood by both the founders as well as the investors. So these are again some very important clauses. So I mentioned in the previous slide that many investors insist on CCPS because they can get a liquidation preference. The liquidation preference is a preference over the common shareholders or the equity shareholders, and normally they get their money first. And there are 2-3 clauses under liquidation preference: participating, non-participating, etc. So those are technical things which you need to be very careful while negotiating your term sheets and negotiating your shareholders agreement. Similarly, anti-dilution. Of late, this has become very important. As Sachin would know, there have been a lot of down rounds in the last 2 or 3 years, especially with the valuation. There's a mismatch in valuation expectations. It is very important to make sure that these terms are like well understood, well drafted in the agreement. And typically, most good investors put anti-dilution because they don't want their percentage holding to suffer just because there is a down round. I assume that most of you know what is a down round. So like if you have raised at a 10 crore valuation, say last year, and this year you're raising at an 8 crore valuation, then that is called a down round. So, and preemptive rights, basically it gets triggered when you do subsequent rounds of funding, and the holders who have preemptive rights should be given a right to subscribe first. So only if they refuse, then can you go to the other shareholders. So some of these clauses like exit, conditions precedent, subsequent are also normally covered in a SHA. Exit can be through strategic sale, buyback, liquidation, mergers and amalgamations, and of course over the last 2-3 years a lot of IPO exits have also happened. And typically conditions precedent is part of your investment transaction. So typically when a due diligence happens, if there are any findings from the due diligence team or the investor team, they expect those to be fixed before they put their money in, because they don't want any overhang of any past compliance issues. So these are normally covered under conditions precedent, and it is expected that these are resolved before the funds hit the bank account. And post funding, there may be a few terms which have to be done, like few filings with ROC, issuance of share certificates, stamping of the share certificates, payment of stamp duty. These are normally covered under conditions subsequent, and these are very important for us to ensure that the transaction is complete in all aspects. So there are a lot of pre-money and post-money compliance. Pre-money refers to before the money has come, and post-money are the compliances which need to be done once the money hits the bank account. So, I mean, there's a list over here, but I'll just take you through few things. You have to increase the authorized share capital, maybe you have to appoint a registered valuer. Then very important thing is whenever you raise funds, please open a separate bank account. It is very important. Many people don't take this seriously, but there have been a lot of compliance and notices because of this. So these are some of the steps to be taken before the money hits the bank account. And once the money hits the bank account, it is all the ROC filings, issuance of share certificate, payment of stamp duty, and obviously updation of all the registers, like the shareholders registers, etc. And in a few cases, even the charter documents like articles of association may need to be amended to take into account the latest terms and conditions, etc. So what are the consequences of non-compliance? Actually, consequences of non-compliance are many. And of late with the valuation game also heating up, and there have been a lot of cases of fraud or negligence both on part of startups and investors over the last few months. Due diligence has taken a very important thing. I'm sure Sachin would know that nowadays investors have become very strict in due diligence, and even for small rounds of like 2 million, 2.5, 3 million, etc. They do a deep dive on both financial and secretarial and legal diligence. And the reason for that is very simple. So like non-compliance of like basic things nowadays are like, and with things already, the tracking mechanisms at both income tax, ROC, etc. have farly improved. So for things to go undetected is like very difficult these days, and many of these penalties are like very severe, and if you have repeated non-compliances, these could be red flags in your subsequent funding rounds. The investors may feel that like maybe the founders are not like very rigorous in their compliance, and they are not very serious about their compliance. So this may be a big red flag in your future funding rounds. So these are some of the some recent orders where huge fines were levied on companies for non-compliances. I'll just skip through this because I mean the idea was to just let you know the seriousness rather than. And these are some of the other compliances which are private limited is these are non-funding related compliances. So there's a whole host of compliance, and founders are not expected to actually know these things. So my suggestion is, as Sachin also said, hire good lawyers, hire good company secretaries, have a good accounting team, have a good chartered accountant working with you. I know these things cannot be bought in-house on day one, but like work with good professionals who have worked with startups before, who have worked with investors before, so that you sail through all your due diligence, compliance, etc. So the last thing you want is you have a term sheet, but the due diligence doesn't go through. Nothing can be worse thing. And all the investors speak to each other, so don't think that if one investor has raised red flags in your due diligence, the other will not raise. They all speak to each other, and market is very small. Word goes out in the market, and we have seen many cases where a funding round of some 3 or 4 million took 6 months because of due diligence. And these are happening, and I will keep speaking to other investors. These are happening very frequently nowadays. So nobody wants to take a risk at the end of the day, and because investors also are answerable to their LPs, to their HNI investors who have invested.